Hello, everybody. In the past couple of weeks, I've gotten a few comments asking for some book recommendations that cover the kinds of movies I talk about on this channel, exploitation, Grindhouse stuff. So I went through my library over here and I pulled out some, and let's take a look. Editing Rob here. In the time since I recorded this video, another book showed up that you might be interested in. Sick Flicks from Mike Bracken. That's right, Mike Bracken from right here on YouTube, host of the channel, Sick Flicks, has put out a book called Sick Flicks, and in it, he reviews 50 movies which are, well, sick flicks. Your kind of stuff. So, show Mike some love, pick up his book. If you don't know his channel, you should definitely watch his channel. I'm sure you'll like it. Number 1, Sleazoid Express. My channel, if it has a specialization, it specializes in that 60s New York sexploitation scene, in particular the roughies, and that is pretty much what this book covers. This book is, as it says in the cover, a mind-twisting tour through the Grindhouse cinema of Times Square. Yeah, so this book provides lots of history of the people involved in that 42nd Street, Grindhouse scene in New York, mostly here in the 60s and I think into the 70s and maybe even in the early 80s, and then the whole area got Disney-fied and doesn't exist anymore. So there's a cool little time capsule of a very sleazy place, I guess. Yeah, so if you want to know more about the theaters and the filmmakers and the crowds and the bookshops and all the other little sleazy touches from that scene, this is your book. I will say, though, as interesting as this book is, and as much as I liked it, I did find myself skipping parts of it, because at certain points, the book does a kind of scene-by-scene breakdown of some of these films, and I didn't need that, because I've seen all those films. I don't need a scene-by-scene breakdown of Michael Finlay's Flesh trilogy. I've seen that trilogy, 5, 10 times. I didn't need that. But I guess it was written for people that maybe didn't have access to this stuff originally back in the day, so it makes kind of sense. But, if you're like me and you've seen all these movies, you can just kind of skip those parts of the book. Still, great book, highly recommended. Keeping with that New York scene, check this one out. This is pretty cool. This is American Exxxtasy. Has a subtitle, My 30-Year Search for a Happy Ending by John Amero. So John Amero and his brother Lem were filmmakers in that 60s sexploitation scene in New York. They were friends with Roberta and Michael Finlay, and they helped out other filmmakers at the time make their movies, edit them and teach them how to use the equipment and stuff. And this book is his memoir of that time, which is pretty cool. So if you want a kind of, ground view, what do you say, a boots on the ground view of what it was like working in that scene, this is your book. Really interesting. I'm really glad he wrote it. This is not that old. John, last I checked, was still alive. This was published originally in 2020, so yeah, this is not that old. After I read this, I even sent John Amero a letter thanking him for writing the book, and he wrote me back, and that was really cool of him. So yeah, awesome account, highly recommended if you want more details on what the people were like who were making these movies. So, keeping with that exploitation Grindhouse scene, I can recommend this mighty tome. This is Nightmare USA. Look how big this thing is. This thing is huge and it's heavy. It is, as the subtitle says, the untold story of the exploitation independence. So this book goes through, like it says in the back, between 1970 and 1985. And it takes a deep dive look at a lot of the Mostly horror films, but not just horror films. And the book is cool. The layout is great. See if I can find some pictures that are suitable to maybe show. There's lots of pictures and advertisements and essays and posters. Oh, that looks like that's maybe one of the essays on Don't Go in the House. I recognize the the fire room scene there. Whew, that's a classic. I haven't read this whole thing yet. I've only read bits and pieces because I just got this book for Christmas, and I haven't really sat down with it and gone all the way through. There's a section on The Deadly Spawn, which I read because I love that movie, and some other little stuff here and there, but I've been mostly reading comedy in the past couple of months, so I haven't gone all the way through that. But what I read is great enough to recommend. Well, keeping with the 70s, a big movement in 70s cinema was Blaxploitation films, and for that, you gotta get this book, Blaxploitation Cinema, The Essential Reference Guide by Josiah Howard. Great book. It covers pretty much every Blaxploitation film ever made. It's set up like that, where it's got little mini reviews, synopses of the movies, also plenty of posters, and there's interviews with some filmmakers, like Jonathan Haaga, for example. He made MMA and Penitentiary and some other stuff from the time. And if you're want to explore Blaxploitation more, this is your book. It's great. And I've found a lot of films thanks to this book. It's definitely worth checking out, particularly if you're interested in Blaxploitation cinema. But even if you're not, it's still worth checking out. It's such an interesting period of American cinema it's worth checking out just because it's interesting. Okay, well, exploitation cinema didn't start in the 1960s or even the 1970s after the Hays Code died. It existed before. And this book, Bold, Daring, Shocking, True, goes through the history of exploitation films from 1919 to 1959. So this is the classic period of exploitation films before the modern period started in 1959. The modern period, by the way, started with Russ Meyer. So this is what was happening in the exploitation space before Russ Meyer, basically. And it's relatively academic, but still very interesting. And it goes through, the book is kind of structured by taking a look at the different genres of exploitation films that were popular pre-Russ Meyer. So Russ Meyer, as we know, he invented the nudie cutie, and that just sort of took things in a totally different direction because we got the cuties in the early 60s. Which got, a little bit rougher in the early 60s with the roughies, and we know the story. Before all of that, we had those nudist camp films, you had those like the drug and crime films and the Mondo films, and he goes through all of those genres here, who the players were, how they got the stuff out there, how they, escaped the law in certain cases. Very interesting, because a lot of that stuff, not exactly legal. It wasn't even exactly legal in the 60s either. So pretty interesting period of film history here. Bold, daring, shocking, true. Definitely recommend this one, especially if you're interested in what was going on before the movies that we know a lot about. Another kind of academic one. This one's more for the horror fans. Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol Clover. This book takes a look at the exploitation films, mostly the 70s into the early 80s, I think, and it concentrates a lot on the revenge films. I Spit on Your Grave, Last House on Your Left, stuff like that. In fact, this writer, Carol Carol J. Clover. She is the person who coined the term final girl. So every slasher fan these days knows that phrase, final girl. That's where it comes from. Not this book, it comes from an essay, but it comes from her, this writer. She coined that phrase. And, she coined it in talking about revenge films like I Spit on Your Grave, not necessarily slasher films, but, it's the same sort of principle that applies to slasher films as well. So if you want sort of a feminist academic look at some of these films, this is the one. Another kind of academic book, The Monster Show, A Cultural History of Horror. This one concentrates, like the title suggests, it's concentrated on horror films, and it's also a pretty big kind of thing. It's another very sort of academic book. It reads a lot like some humanities student master's thesis. Well, it's pretty long. PhD dissertation, perhaps, is kind of how it reads. With all kinds of works cited at the back and stuff like that. It's an academic book, but, it does go through a lot of cool history of monster films. The Universal stuff, yes, but also some of the exploitation stuff, like Todd Browning's Freaks, for example, and later Night of the Living Dead, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, stuff like that. Well, speaking of Russ Meyer, if you want to know all kinds of cool stuff about Russ Meyer, you gotta read his biography. Big Bosoms and Square Jaws by Jimmy McDonough. This is a fantastic biography. Jimmy McDonough is a great writer, and what makes his book so great is you can tell he loves the stuff. And even though he loves the stuff, he's not afraid to, present it as a kind of warts and all picture. So it's really just fantastic stuff. It goes through Russ's entire career. It's not a biography of his life so much as it is a biography of his life during the time he was making movies. So it starts kind of with The Immoral Mr. T's and goes from there. Well, another film company that I touch on in the channel occasionally, because I'm a big fan, is Troma. And this book, Make Your Own Damn Movie, from Lloyd Kaufman, is a pretty cool resource for independent filmmakers. So if you're interested in how Troma makes their movies and maybe pick up some tips and tricks if you want to make your own movie, take a look at this book, Make Your Own Damn Movie. There's a bunch of these in the series. This one kind of is a general overview, but there are other ones that get more particular about producing the film and whatever. And there's even like a documentary series that you can watch on Troma Now, for example, that goes through even more details. But, if you just want to start somewhere as like a general overview of how an independent filmmaker, Lloyd Kaufman, makes movies, this is pretty cool. Okay, and finally, it's not an exploitation filmmaker per se, it's an art house indie filmmaker. One really interesting thing about that New York scene that I talk about all the time is during that time, that wasn't the only independent scene happening in New York. There was the, exploitation roughy scene happening, 42nd Street area with the Finlays and the Ameros and the Sarnos and, all these names that we know. But at the same time, in New York, there was another independent movie scene going on, and one of the people involved in that scene was this guy here, Robert Downey Sr. That's right, the father of the Robert Downey Jr. that we all know. And this book, which just came out last year, is a collection of essays on his work. And his work is really interesting, and it's definitely not for everyone. But it is really interesting. I'm a big fan. This book, the essays are pretty cool. And not only are the essays cool, but the layout is nice. We get some pictures in here, and it's got a nice sort of like color theme that runs through the book. Wonderful, wonderful book. And it's new. This came out last year, 2025. So Truth and Soul, a Robert Downey reader, edited by Keir, Janisse, and Clint Enns. Yeah, this is pretty cool. Definitely recommend that if you're interested in a different independent filmmaker from New York. In fact, if you want to watch those independent films that this book spends a lot of time on, you should pick up this. This is Criterion Up All Night collection, the Eclipse series. This is number 33. It includes Robert Downey Sr.'s independent films, Babbo 73, Chafed Elbows, No More Excuses, Putney Swope, 2 Tons of Turquoise to Taos Tonight. Interesting stuff, crazy stuff, wild stuff. Sadly, this is just his independent stuff. He made some studio films which are not here, which is really kind of too bad, because it would be great if Pound, for example, got a nice release, because that is nearly a lost film at this point. Okay, so those are the ones I have physical copies of. There's some other stuff that's well worth checking out if you can find them. So David F. Friedman's got autobiography bumping around out there somewhere. Very difficult to find, but, you know, if you can find it, that's worth checking out. I have seen digital copies floating around, FYI, but I haven't managed to find a physical copy of it, at least not for any price that approaches reasonable. Okay, so there you go. I hope that was interesting. I hope it was helpful. I'll leave, the list of names down below in the description. If you have any other books that you think would fit in well with this collection, let me know.